Hello again, and welcome to another webinar in the series covering the VetCert standard. This session covers Unit 7, Surveying of Veteran Trees and Veteran Tree Sites. And this is split into two subsections. The first one, conduct a tree survey where veteran trees make up part or all of the tree population. Describe diagnostic tools which can be used as part of a veteran tree inspection. The first part, conducting the tree survey, is a big part of this unit. So we'll go through that. So the first, conduct a tree survey where veteran trees make up a part or all of the tree population. So this is where we would be expecting you to be able to look at the values, which we've already talked about, biodiversity values, heritage values, historic, social values, the condition of the tree, looking at vitality, physiological condition, structural condition, characteristics of the species, such as propensity for decay, type of decay, the tree architecture, how well is it likely to respond to management, any threats, that what is the driving need for management, how is the land around the tree with regards to the soil and the roots, that's crucial, but other things like shade, structural and physiological condition, what do they have in terms of threats, and that a pro forma sheet in such terms that we would be expecting you as a consultant to be able to put together something so that you can collect the information in an appropriate way that's consistent. That you will be expected to assess the physiological condition of a veteran tree in quite a lot of detail, and this should be something that we expect you to use to underpin your recommendations. You need to be able to convey that you've looked at the tree and you've observed the detail beyond standard arboriculture. So beyond just saying good, fair or poor or insufficient, that's insufficient. We would expect you to be able to spot, for example, what process the tree is in. Is it in retrenchment or is it actually dieback due to severe stress? Is it recovering from stress? Which stage of the retrenchment process? And is the crown a complex crown? So are there differences in different parts of the crown? We would expect you to be able to discuss and take account of that and identify it, of course. Here's an example where we've got two trees. The one on the left has lost a part of its crown and has quite a different part of its crown on the right hand side. Potentially also functional units here. The tree on the right has lost the upper crown and is building a lower crown as a consequence of that. How different is the tree in those different parts of the crown is something that we would expect you to be able to spot and discuss in your assessments. We also would expect you to be able to identify a range of biomechanical defects that may affect the stability of the tree, make an assessment of their severity with respect to failure, but also the fact of these habitats, the fact that we would expect you as a veteran tree consultant to be able to identify that biomechanical defects, as we call them very often, may actually be habitats in this context, and that the priority for you would be about how you can prolong the life of the tree as opposed to always going for risk management, and that we would expect you to be able to identify if there's weak forks, if there's lifted root plates, if there's splitting, the decay, what type of decay it is, the tree's response to that sort of decay. So it's all about kind of you being able to spot those things and spot them in the context and assess them in the context of a veteran tree, because the body language of veteran trees may not follow standard formats. We all know that. They may have had historic management such as pollarding. They may have had bans around them. All sorts of different things can have impacted on their potential body language. So that's important for you as a VetCert consultant to be able to spot and assess. This is an example of a fantastic old ash tree that's lost huge parts. You would say this is full of defects, but clearly many of those are actually very, very important habitats as well. Then we expect you to be able to collect information in relation to the context within which the tree sits. So the landscape, this particular picture shows this is probably, the road is there, but the trees may well predate the road, that there are layers of history which we would expect you to be able to spot. You may be able to, can you read the landscape? And this is an area, again, I think I've mentioned earlier, which has been quite challenging for some arborists in particular, because it's not something necessarily that you've studied particularly before, but it's that you're very used to studying trees, and the trees can actually tell a story about what's happened and how things have changed over time as well, and that these issues may in turn have an impact on the management suggestion. So it's something we would expect you to be able to spot, or at least think about and identify and share how you've thought about it and what impact it potentially has. This tree's obviously been planted, something else been growing on the ground. Some of the trees are in rows. There's age gaps potentially. There's younger trees being planted, but quite a big age gap between those trees. So again, the layers of the history here are quite interesting and are potentially relevant for the management of this particular tree and the other trees in the area. We expect you to be able to identify and record veteran trees according to recognised criteria, taking account of any such trees that may occur outside of the survey area. So, as we know, as landscapes have become fragmented, it's important to see outside of the specific survey area. So, for example, you've been asked to look at, in a housing estate, at a couple of veteran trees. Actually, we would be expecting you to be able to think about the fact you may have a look around the outside of the housing area. It might well give you an idea that this is part of a wider landscape that has been exploited and that it's on a former wood pasture, in fact. So there may be other old trees remaining either in people's gardens or outside in a neighbouring field. So understanding how to identify them and record these veteran trees, and it may be recognised criteria according to a method or system in your country, and that you can actually undertake that kind of survey. Another important part is that you should be able to identify a range of key species associated with veteran trees, although must be clear here, we are not expecting you to be an expert on identifying all species groups that occur on veteran trees. There's no human being that can possibly do that. In fact, we have specialists who are very good at epiphytes, but they may be not very good at invertebrates. So that's just as important, I feel, in these webinars to tell you what we do expect you to know, also actually what we don't expect you to know. So in Unit 3, we talked about the fact you were required to identify habitats and understand the habitat requirements of some of these species, but this builds on that section. And we would, however, expect you to be able to have an idea of the different groups of species, so that there are epiphytes, there are lichens and mosses that grow on older trees, and that also you may have an idea about how they might be surveyed and what methods you might use, and then also to understand what kind of habitat requirements these particular groups of species have, and then in turn what that impact might be for your management. And I guess this is about, as we were saying earlier, it's about applying your knowledge. The exception to this is regard to wood decay fungi. We do expect the consultant level to be able to identify the main species of wood decay fungi in the country of examination, where those fruit bodies would expect to be spotted on the tree, the main host types, and the type of wood decay they cause. We would also expect you to be able to comment on the extent of the type of decay they have and the impact on the structural integrity of the tree. So whilst we wouldn't expect you to be able to identify every single fungi, we would expect you to have a good working knowledge of the most common wood decay fungi species and also their modus operandi in relation to the trees you're looking at. Fungi and trees is something that's very poorly understood in general, and that's something that is really significant with regard to veteran trees, the relationship between trees and fungi, and that we would expect a vet cert specialist to be able to understand the complexities and how that might change over time, that there may be succession and change over time. Some fungal species are more or less opportunistic and maybe actually triggered by other factors. The fungi often get the kind of the bad press, but others may actually be secondary, come later. And if the sapwood is exposed, air is allowed into the wood, fungal spores can enter this way and it encourages decay when air comes into the wood. If the sapwood's intact, there may actually be fungal propagules in the sapwood. And then heartwood, that we've got those species that are decayers of the central, often dead wood of a tree. And then, of course, there are active pathogens, but understanding that there are all these different life strategies and that some of these species may actually change from one to the other over time. So then once you've undertaken all your survey and you've collected lots of information with regarding this particular individual tree or group of trees, we expect you to be able to interpret that information and identify management options to inform a veteran tree management plan. Now, I want to be clear here that we all know that there are real challenges with veteran tree management in that there's rarely an absolute right answer. There may be better and worse answers, and there's not often an absolute clear solution, that there may be 2 or 3 different potential options which are suitable for an individual tree. But we expect you to be able to explain what you've observed and how you've come to that conclusion, thinking about the pros and cons. And that's not something we're used to particularly in our work. We may well process that in our heads, but it's rarely something you would write in a report. But this is, in a way, when we're testing you for your knowledge of vet cert, it's a bit like a maths exam in a way. We need to be able to see your workings out. We need to be able to understand your thought processes, and it also helps us understand how you've reached your conclusion. So this is something that you probably would do anyway in your head, but it wouldn't be something you would write down. But it is very important that you can weigh up these different options and come to the conclusion as to which you think is the best given the circumstances and the knowledge that you have available to you. So then, as part of that tour, we'd like you to be able to, that there's all sorts of methods and theories with regards to tree surveying and assessment. And here's just a few examples: the T/R ratio, there's visual tree assessment, there's tree statics, there's different ways of actually identifying, particularly in relation to the biomechanical nature situation that the tree is in. And in a way, we're not so much interested in you being able to explain all of these to us in detail, because in a way that's standard arboriculture. But what we are interested in is your understanding of the limitations of these different techniques in relation to veteran tree management. That most tree assessment methods and theories are actually built on a series of assumptions and modelling, quite often on what we would say straightforward standard trees. And veteran trees are generally much more complex. They have more complex biomechanical structures, they may be separate functional units, they may have layered, and that means that you need to be able to understand the limitations of these different methods when you're undertaking your assessments, and we would expect you as a vet cert specialist to be able to explain what those limitations are. So for example, if we take the T/R ratio, that it's really only been tested on fully crowned trees, not trees that are retrenching. So that was just one example whereby understanding the limitations, it doesn't mean that that they have their place, but it's just if you use them without understanding their limitations with regard to veteran trees, the answers that you come to or the conclusions that you draw may be actually really quite wrong. And then we would expect you to be able to understand the difference between surveying individual trees and veteran tree landscapes, so populations of veteran trees. Now, quite often it may be an individual special tree that you're surveying, but actually serving whole populations may actually be slightly different, at least whole populations of veteran trees that you're surveying. The time and money available may be different. The detail that you may be able to record and assess for those trees may also be different. But it also is important to understand the bigger picture, that the population, do we only have lots of old trees? Do we have just young trees? Is there an age gap? And how is the regeneration? That will have an impact on your management, because not every tree needs management or even will respond to management. And so it is very important to have a system by which you can prioritise and helps the site manager to be able to prioritise which trees are worth investing in, which trees are not worth investing in, and if there are issues with regards to gaps in the age structure. So we need you to be able to demonstrate that understanding as to the differences. So time and money, bigger picture, maybe not as much detail that you need to record, and able to prioritise those trees which will respond to management. Here's an example of a large wood pasture with several hundred old pollards, and actually it may be more important to assess all of those trees quickly than to go into a lot of detail for one or two individuals. And those are often some of the challenging, that's up to you to help either you as a site manager, or if you're working for a site manager, to help them understand based on the budgets and the finances that are available. An important point, and I guess it sounds a bit like a no-brainer really, collecting sufficient information to allow veteran trees to be located by others and identified. Those of us who have worked with this will know how very difficult it often is to go back and find the same tree again, particularly if you're doing surveys of large populations. This photograph we put in here, how easy would it be for you to re-find that tree? I have got hundreds of thousands of pictures of trees that look just like that because of the weather being bad or getting dark. But actually, we would expect you to be able to show what information is essential so that someone who's coming after you can re-find that tree. And coordinates, a map, obviously, the tree may be tagged, photographs, but only if it's a decent photograph. And that, it avoids wasting time and money locating the tree, because if you're a consultant, you're doing your assessment of the tree, then it may be an arborist that needs to come later to do the climbing work. They need to be able to find it again. Otherwise, your work and effort, and it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's something we'll expect you to be able to know and be able to think about and show when you undertake the exam. We expect a VetCert consultant to be able to undertake a financial valuation of veteran trees, but actually, more importantly, to be able to show an awareness of the potential limitations of valuation systems. So that's a bit like we were talking about these diagnostic tools or theories and methods, that each of them have their limitations with regard to veteran trees. In fact, very few actually take account of, for example, biodiversity, and most of them take away a financial value if the tree has hollows or decay or other kinds of defects. So it's that kind of thing we would expect you to be aware of, the limitations of the systems. And there are all sorts of methods. In all countries in Europe, people have developed different sorts of methods. So you need to be aware of the systems that are used in your country, and you need to be aware also of the limitations. There's a fact sheet about this that we've produced specifically for VetCert. So that's everything in the first section. The second one is the diagnostic tools, which can be used as part of a veteran tree inspection. So this is where we would expect you to be able to describe a range of the different tools that are available, how you would interpret the results specifically for veteran trees. And once again, this is like the previous things we've talked about, that many of these tools are fantastic, but they can potentially, if used wrongly, result in catastrophic management for veteran trees. And we would expect you to be able to describe pros and cons for a range of diagnostic tools, and also give examples of where they can be used to inform veteran tree management, but where they also have their limitations. So if we take an example with the chlorophyll fluorescence, for example, it's a very useful tool, but the results that you get, if there are different functional units, may be different. And even the location of where you take those samples may be different, but particularly in relation to functional units. Tomography, it may not really, one kind of picture, one cross section may not at all give you the full picture of a complex stem structure where there's hollowing and decay. So it's just kind of understanding the pros and cons of these different tools. And again, there's help on the VetCert website to give you some indication of what we're talking about if that's something you're not familiar with. David Lonsdale's book, Chapter 2, Veterinary Survey and Evaluation, that's available, and that's got some information in relation to this. Then there's also some fact sheets on VetCert. So one of them is on diagnostic tools, as I've just mentioned. There's also a fact sheet on the wildlife value and species. So a species fact sheet to help you with these guilds of groups of species that we expect you to have a working knowledge of what habitat requirements they have and what potential impact that has on management. There's an article on tree architecture, and there's also a fact sheet on the different economic valuation methods that are available in Europe and what the pros and cons of those are in relation to veteran trees. And then in relation to fungi and trees, we've developed 8 videos which we've done in cooperation with Professor Lynn Boddy, and those are available on the VetCert website and on the Ancient Tree Forum website. I would thoroughly recommend, if this is an area that you're less familiar with, and even if it's an area you're familiar with, these films are really, really interesting and worth a look. Most of them are not much more than 5 or 6 minutes. So next time we'll cover Unit 8, which is legislation, and Unit 9, which is risk management in relation to veteran trees. So thank you, and see you again soon.